Greetings and welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 11. Chapter 11 covers foraging behavior. Foraging behavior, not surprisingly, is very important in the lives of both human and non-human animals, as some of us human animals have been finding out recently. I recorded this in late March of 2020, and we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And one of the big things that people are foraging for is not just food, but toilet paper. So I suspect all of us at this point can probably identify with some of the topics that I'll be going over in this chapter. Now, when it comes to foraging, as I said, there's been a lot of research into foraging behavior simply because it takes up a lot of the animal's time. Most animals spend the majority of their time, well, it's one of those they spend as much time foraging as they need to spend, but animals don't tend to waste energy that they don't need to. And so, for instance, if they have a source of food nearby that's useful, they may spend less time foraging, less time moving around in general than animals that do not, that may not. Now, one of the things that's been researched quite a bit in terms of animal foraging is the idea of something called a search image. And the search image is so called because the animal that is foraging needs to have some idea of what it's looking for. And so therefore, the idea is that the animal has some sort of representation of what it's looking for. They have, in humans, we would say you have a sort of an idea in your head of what exactly is going on here, what exactly it is that you're looking for. And it's true that non-human animals might as well. As a human, if you think about, for instance, I sometimes think about search images when I'm digging through my junk drawer, which is full of potentially useful stuff. If I'm looking for something in particular, then I'll have an idea of what it is that I'm looking for. It's not just a verbal word, it's usually an image of some kind. And I can really tell that I found it when something matches the image. This can be a problem, of course, when what you're looking for doesn't really match your image, or you don't have a good search image. It's going to be a lot harder to find it. So it's thought that this search image might be either something that is really, really salient, something that's important, something that's noticeable, something that just pops out. So it might be a color, it might be a shape, it might be, a sound that it makes. Excuse me. Hairball. It could be any of a number of things that essentially the individual, or it could be an overall representation. It could be just sort of a more of a visual picture. If I'm looking for a screwdriver, for instance, I could look at one or two important and noticeable attributes, which is it tends to be long, it tends to be, part of it at least is shiny, it tends to be of a certain color. I have a lot of screwdrivers, for instance, are kind of brightly colored, presumably in the hope that it would help you to find it. Some of my screwdrivers are yellow, that tends to stick out, or it could be an overall representation, in which it can include all of those things. It's yellow and black on one end, it's silvery, whether it's a flathead or whether it's a Phillips screwdriver or what the size is. So I have an idea. It could be an overall representation or it could be one or two important notes. The same thing is true with non-human animals. They have an idea of what it is that they're looking for. It might be size, it might be color, it might be an overall representation. If a dolphin is looking for a fish, well, they're probably not looking using their eyes. But if they are looking using their eyes, since humans are visual, we tend to relate best to that, then they might look for a flicker in the water, or they might look for silver, or they might look for movement, or they might have an image actually of a fish. Maybe there are fish that they prefer. And so they're going to look for that one fish and maybe take a little more time to look for it. We'll talk about the decisions that are made a little bit later. Or if it is a bee, for instance, looking for a particular flower, they could be looking for a color, they could be looking for a shape, they could be looking for a size, or they could be looking for an actual representation. Now, what this search image does is it allows us to essentially see things, find things faster. If you have a visual idea or some sort of idea of what it is that visual, auditory, I'm also visually oriented being a human. So If you have some sort of idea of what it is that you're looking for, it would hopefully allow you to find it faster, and would also hopefully allow you to be able to tell prey from non-prey. I got a lot of junk in my junk drawer, hence the name. I have other tools in my junk drawer. I have scissors that are also plastic on one end and sort of long and silvery on the other. I have wrenches. I have all sorts of interesting things in there. Sometimes it worries me what I have in there. But if I'm looking for a screwdriver, then I have that idea in my head, and it helps me to more quickly. I don't have to pick everything up and go, is that a screwdriver? No. So I don't have to pick everything out one by one. And a non-human animal doesn't have to, spend a lot of time going, screwdriver or non-screwdriver. Does it match the image? Investigate further. If it doesn't match, move on. You hear a lot of talk in this, or at least I have, because after all, a lot of my graduate research was essentially optimal foraging. That's what I got my master's degree in. Optimal foraging theory is just that. It's a theory that's been devised through the past couple of decades in order to best describe how individuals forage for food. The first thing I want to tell you, and probably the most welcome thing I want to tell you, is that in this case, don't worry about the math. Okay? They've got a whole page of formulas. Don't worry about that. I'm not even going to ask you to know the formula for this one. Okay? So don't worry about the math. You do need to understand it, okay? And I'm going to go over essentially what goes on in optimal foraging theory, but you don't need to know the math, and you don't need to know the names. I could care less that you know who came up with this, okay? So don't worry about that. Just stick with the information, and you'll be okay. So what optimal foraging theory suggests, it has some, theorems. It has some givens that go along with it, things that are understood to be true. The first is that an individual that is foraging can only go for one food at a time. That an individual that, is not going to be able to necessarily grab food, with all four paws, or they're going to go for one thing at a time. Okay? And the choice is, in a lot of times, whether they take this food or whether they look for another food. Okay? That's a lot of the choice. Do I try to get this? Do I try to go to another? And when they're making that choice, they have to weigh a lot of different variables. Okay? The first is how many calories is in the food. There is some food that might be very, very high in calories, and therefore one might be more likely to go for. There's other food that is lower in calories. Now, if you're an animal, by the way, the odds are you're not on a diet. So you're going to want to maximize your calories. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. You're going to want to maximize your calories. You're going to want to get as much food as quickly as possible because foraging has a cost to it. It has a cost to it in terms of energy burned. It has a cost to it because the individual is out in the open and run the risk of being preyed upon or being injured if it's hunting. It has a risk. So therefore, how many calories is available in the food? That is number one variable. Number two is how often do you, quote unquote, run into the food? By the way, I didn't say this at the beginning. I am going to be lecturing faster than I normally would. And that is because through the wonders of video, you can pause this, you can rewind it, you can watch it as many times as you need to. So get used to me just rattling on and on and on. It also minimizes the amount of time that you have to sit and watch these videos, which I suspect is a good thing as well. And it minimizes the amount of time I have to make them. Because for every 15-minute video I make, it takes about 3 times as long to prep and record and process and upload and everything else. So yeah, we're going for minimal here. Encounter rate. How often does the individual run into the food? If they don't run into the food very often, then once they see it, they should probably go for it. If the food is very common, maybe they could skip it because they know they can always come back and get it later. So they need to weigh the energy value, how many calories. How common is the food? And then lastly, how easily acquired is the food? This is called handling time. Again, we're being human-centric. We're assuming they have hands. Not all of them do. But how long does it take to get the food, whether they have to catch it, whether they have to travel to find it, whether they have to graze on it, whatever it is. How long does it take them to eat the food? Some food may take a lot longer to eat. For instance, can take quite a while for a sea otter to eat an abalone because abalone have very hard shells. So that's part of it as well. Also, how long to digest the food. Um, there is some food, for instance, that it just takes quite a while to digest. A lot of the proteins, for instance, may take a while. On the other hand, carbohydrates digest almost as fast as you eat them. Um, and also just some food, if the food has a lot of fiber, it takes longer to digest. There are some individuals, some species that forage on food that is so limited in caloric value that they almost have to digest it twice. I talked about this in class in terms of rabbits eating their own droppings, but only certain droppings, so they can redigest the food, or ungulates chewing their cud. Yeah, that is also part of the equation. And so all of these basically go into decisions. Now, it's possible very often to look at just two of these. The encounter rate is the one that kind of gets left out because the encounter rate is something to consider, but it's maybe not as important as some of the others. But generally, the rule of thumb of optimal foraging is that there are some foods that are more profitable than others. Specifically, you want foods that are high in energy and low in handling time. You want foods that are going to give you a lot of energy, and you want foods that are easy to catch, easy to digest, easy to, to ingest, easy to get. So the ideal food, of course, would be what a lot of people are doing now, which is you sit back and you order and someone else gets the food and they bring it to you, and you basically have to do very, very little in order to get food. But the vast majority of people, not to mention the vast majority of animals, with the possible exception of our pets and other domesticated animals that we care for, animals have to work a lot harder than that in order to get their food. But what the idea is you want to maximize energy value and minimize the time and energy it takes you to get that food. Now, I can only record 15 minutes at a time on these videos, which is probably a good thing because you don't need to sit back and listen to me going blah, 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 as you know that I can do. So I'm actually going to cut this one short, and I'll number them so they're in order of which you need to watch. And then you can hopefully move on to the next one. By the way, I am not going to spend very much time at all going over the examples that you can read about in your textbook. They're explained well enough that hopefully you'll be able to get what they're saying. So you're still going to need to read the book. You're still going to have to go through and understand the examples, but hopefully I'll explain the main points well enough, the way I generally did in class. I didn't go over all the examples in class either. So hopefully this is enough for you to be able to get the information. If it isn't, remember I have office hours during class time. And with that, let's move on to the next.